My name is Abigail Nolan. I'm 28 years old, and on my last birthday, my own sister told me to get out of her house. It happened in the middle of a weekend party at a rented lake house, the kind of place people post all over social media. Music was playing, people were holding paper plates and plastic cups, and I was just trying to cut my cake without thinking too hard about how strange it felt to celebrate away from my actual home. Then my sister stood up behind me and raised her voice over everyone else. She didn't ease into it. She didn't warn me. She simply pointed toward the door and announced that this was my last night sleeping under her roof, that the house I'd worked for, signed for, and paid for was now hers, and I should start packing. For a second, nobody moved. Then a few relatives started clapping, nervous at first, then louder, as if it were some kind of sweet surprise instead of an eviction notice disguised as a toast. I remember the sound more than the words, the way people looked at me like they were waiting to see a meltdown. I didn't give them one. I just set the plastic knife down, wiped frosting off my fingers, and reached into my bag for the envelope I had brought just in case. My heart was pounding, but my hands were steady. If she wanted an announcement, she was about to get one. I held the envelope up and smiled. "Then everyone should know this," I said, and the room went quiet in an instant. Before I tell you what he said and what happened after I walked out, tell me, what time is it for you right now, and where are you watching from? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. The music didn't stop when the room went quiet. It just faded into the background. For a moment, everyone stared at the envelope in my hand, not because they thought I was dangerous, but because they realized I hadn't walked into that weekend as blindly as they hoped. I could feel eyes moving between my face and the envelope, measuring how serious I was. My sister was the first one to move. She laughed in that sharp, practiced way she uses when she wants people on her side, then slid closer and rested a hand on my shoulder as if this were still a harmless joke. She tried to turn my envelope into a punchline, telling everyone I was dramatic, that I always overreacted, that I should be grateful she and my parents had fixed the house situation for me. That was the first time I heard my home described as something broken that needed their help. No one mentioned the years I had lived there alone, worked through weekends to keep up with the mortgage, or said a word about how careful I had been with every decision involving that place. I was suddenly treated like a guest in my own life. My sister's name is Gina Nolan. She is 3 years younger than I am, but she has always moved through our family like the oldest, the one everyone orbits around. Gina grew up assuming that people would smooth things out for her, and most of the time they did. Teresa and Harold, my parents, spent years explaining away her choices, calling them phases, saying she just needed more time. I was the one who picked up extra shifts, paid back small debts she left hanging, and pretended I didn't notice when my things disappeared. At the lake house, Gina kept talking over the uneasy laughter, telling relatives that she and our mother had signed some family papers that made everything easier now. She said it like she was announcing a promotion she had earned, not a transfer built on someone else's effort. A couple of cousins nodded along, because that is what you do when the loudest person in the room tells you how to feel. My mother stayed near the fireplace, holding a cup she didn't drink from, smiling in that tight way that says everything has already been decided. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She just let Gina speak for her. When people glanced her way, she answered with a small nod that said this was all perfectly reasonable. My father hovered by the snack table, avoiding my eyes. He has always been good at standing beside conflict without stepping into it, like a man watching a storm from the porch instead of closing the windows. When one of my uncles muttered that this seemed like the wrong moment for a family announcement, my father brushed it off, saying it was family business and that everyone should support Gina's fresh start. The strange thing about moments like that is how quickly you understand the story other people have been telling about you. In a few confident sentences, I was recast as the rigid one, the selfish one, the sister who refused to share. Gina painted herself as the one stepping up, taking responsibility, giving our parents peace of mind. If you had walked in halfway through, you might have believed her. I knew better. The envelope in my hand was not a prop, and it was not a bluff. It represented weeks of reading, phone calls, and conversations I never expected to have with strangers who knew more about my property rights than my own family seemed willing to admit. I had not driven to that lake planning to humiliate anyone. I had simply decided that if someone tried to take my home away from me in public, the truth would be allowed to stand in the same room. Months before that party, everything around my house still looked ordinary from the outside. I had bought the place in a working-class neighborhood a few years earlier. Nothing fancy, just a small 2-bedroom with peeling paint and a stubborn front door. My name was the only one on the mortgage, my paycheck the only thing making payments, my weekends the only time things got fixed when they broke. The first crack in that sense of safety didn't come from a fight. It arrived in the mail. One afternoon, I opened a thick envelope from a contractor I had never heard of, billing for exterior improvements I hadn't ordered. The address was mine, the description mentioned my street, but the contact number listed under client had my mother's cell phone. When I called her about it, she brushed it off, said it was a mix-up with a neighbor's project and that she would handle it. She always said she would handle things. I wanted to believe her, but the envelope sat on my kitchen counter like a reminder that something with my name on it was being used for someone else's plans. A week later, another envelope showed up, this time from the county recorder's office, confirming that a power of attorney related to my property had been filed. The document said my mother could act on my behalf for convenience. I had never asked for that convenience, and I hadn't knowingly signed anything that broad. I work in an office, not in real estate, but I understood enough to know that anything recorded at the county level mattered. I took the notice to work and showed it to a coworker who had bought a condo recently. She read it twice, then told me to talk to someone who dealt with titles for a living before I convinced myself I was overreacting. That was how I met Blake Stanton, a title specialist who worked at a small firm a few blocks from my building. His office was full of files and quiet tension, the kind of place where paperwork carried more weight than opinions. I handed him the notice, the contractor bill, and the stack of closing documents from when I bought my house. Blake pulled my property record on his screen, then walked me through what he saw. The deed was still in my name, the mortgage still mine, but the power of attorney gave my mother wide authority to sign documents tied to the property. In the wrong hands, he said, that kind of language could be used to move title around without me realizing it until it was too late. I thought back to every time my mother had slid a page across the table and told me it was just a formality. I remembered signing something at her kitchen counter months earlier while she rushed to get dinner on the stove, and my father kept the television loud enough to cover any real questions. Blake didn't tell me what to feel. He simply laid out options. I could sign a revocation of that power of attorney, have it notarized, and file it so there would be a paper trail showing that no one else could speak for my house. I could also request that any future transfer be flagged, forcing extra verification before anything changed on the record. That afternoon, I signed the revocation. My hand shook more than it had when I signed the original mortgage. I watched the notary stamp the page, then slid my copies into a fresh envelope and wrote my own name across the front in thick ink, not for anyone else's benefit, but so I would have to look at it every time I picked it up. Walking out of Blake's office, I understood two things clearly. My house was still legally mine, and my family had already crossed a line I hadn't even seen. I went home, tucked the envelope into the back of my closet, and told myself that if nothing ever came of it, at least the record would exist where it mattered. At the lake house, that envelope felt heavier than it had in my closet. I didn't raise my voice. People were already leaning in, waiting to see how I would react. Instead, I laid the envelope on the coffee table, smoothed the flap with my thumb, and peeled it open as if I had all the time in the world. The first pages I pulled out were copies of the revocation I had signed in Blake Stanton's office, the one that ended my mother's power to speak for my house. The second stack was a packet Blake had prepared, explaining in plain language what those pages meant and when they had been recorded. I wanted the facts on paper where no one could pretend they had misunderstood. I slid the packet toward the nearest relative and told them to pass it along. Eyes moved down the lines, slowed over the official stamps, then snapped up to look at me again with an expression I recognized. The moment people realize a story has two sides, and they picked the wrong one too early. My mother stepped away from the fireplace and asked what I thought I was doing, as if the answer weren't sitting in front of her in black ink. I didn't list every slight or every bill. I simply said that any authority she once held over my property had been revoked months earlier, and that the county had accepted the filing. My sister tried to spin that into another joke, calling it technical stuff, saying families didn't need to be so strict. She reminded everyone that she and my mother had already taken care of things so I could focus on work, as though I were an absent landlord instead of the owner standing in front of them. I didn't argue. I pointed to the date stamp on the copies and let the silence explain what it meant. Whatever they thought they had done came after I had already taken back control. They hadn't helped me. They had moved ahead without the right to do so. Blake was standing by the hallway, blending into a group of co-workers who had come for the lake and stayed for the tension. When the packet reached him, he read through it as if he had never seen it before, then asked if anyone wanted the plain version of what they were holding. People shifted to give him space. He explained that the documents showed my mother's authority had ended, that any attempt to change the title without my signature would be flagged and questioned. He didn't threaten anything or raise his voice. He just described how the process would treat any papers that didn't have my consent. Gina's shoulders tightened. She asked why I had brought a title specialist to my birthday, and someone near the back let out a nervous laugh. I didn't answer her. There was no way to say, "Because I know you," without sounding petty. I had shown up with proof because my family respected paperwork more than they respected words. As the pages moved from hand to hand, the mood shifted. Smiles looked forced. A cousin who had cheered earlier avoided my eyes. My father stared at the floor, his jaw tight, unable to pretend he hadn't heard. I looked around that rented living room with its neutral decor and thought about the difference between this space and my own house. One belonged to a stranger and would forget us as soon as we carried the last trash bag outside. The other had been quietly holding my life together for years. I wasn't going to let anyone turn it into a prize they distributed among themselves. When the packet finally came back to me, I stacked the pages, slipped them into the envelope, and held it against my chest for a moment before tucking it away. The party could go on, or it could end right there. Either way, the record was clear, and my family could no longer pretend they didn't understand where I stood. The lake house emptied faster than I expected once the documents finished their slow circuit around the room. People said they were tired or that they had early drives in the morning, but the way they avoided my eyes said more than their excuses. Cups went into trash bags, food into containers. The music dropped to a background murmur. I stayed until the last relative left, not because I wanted to salvage the evening, but because I refused to be the one who slipped out first. Gina disappeared into a bedroom with her phone. My mother pulled my father into the kitchen, their conversation hushed enough that I caught only fragments between cabinet doors. By the time I stepped outside for air, the lake was dark and flat, reflecting a few porch lights from neighboring rentals. Blake Stanton joined me on the deck a minute later, hands in his jacket pockets. When he did speak, it was only to ask whether I wanted him to file a notice with his office on Monday, or wait to see if my family still tried anything after what they had just heard. I did not need time to think. Waiting was what had gotten us here. I told him to move ahead, to flag my file so that any attempt to use my address without my signature would raise questions before it reached a closing table. He nodded once, then went back inside to grab his keys and leave me with the sound of water hitting the posts beneath the deck. Over the next week, the fallout arrived in pieces. Blake called to confirm that his office had placed the alert on my title and added notes about the revoked authority. He also told me an inquiry had already come in a few days before the party from a lender asking about potential equity on my property. The inquiry listed my address and my mother's contact information, but not my name. That detail was small and enormous at the same time. Someone had been planning around me, not with me. The timing made it clear the celebration at the lake had not been spontaneous generosity. It had been the unveiling of something they thought was already secured. I did not confront my parents in person. Instead, I sent a short email explaining that I knew about the lender inquiry, that any use of my address without my written consent would be treated as unauthorized, and that I would not discuss the matter by phone. When my mother replied, she did not deny anything. She told me I was being ungrateful, that families sometimes needed to use assets creatively, and that she had only been trying to stabilize Gina's life before things got worse. Gina's version reached me through a cousin who still thought forwarding texts counted as staying neutral. According to her, Gina had been talking about using my house as leverage for a personal loan tied to a vague business idea. She believed that as long as paperwork existed somewhere with my mother's signature, my opinion would be a formality. My father called once, then again, leaving a voicemail where he sounded more tired than angry. He said he did not understand all the details, that he had trusted my mother to handle it fairly, and that everything now felt like it was spiraling over something that could have been worked out if I had just talked to them quietly. I deleted the message without calling back. I was done translating other people's choices into softer language just to make everyone more comfortable. In the space of a week, my birthday turned from a marked date into a dividing line. On one side, the family I had grown up with, full of excuses and rearranged truths. On the other, a set of records, warnings, and boundaries that did not care who shared my last name. Next steps did not feel like revenge. They felt like maintenance. Back in my own house, the first thing I did was walk room to room, checking the windows and doors like I was seeing them for the first time. Nothing had changed physically, but it was impossible to ignore the fact that the people who knew this address best had just tried to treat it like a chess piece. I called a locksmith and paid for new locks on every exterior door. While he worked, I cleared out the spare key hiding spots my family knew about. The fake rock near the porch, the loose brick on the back steps, the extra key taped inside the meter box. It felt strange to hold that many copies of my life in one hand and realize how casually I had handed them out. After the locksmith left, I installed a basic camera by the front door. Nothing high-end, just enough to see who came and went. I wasn't expecting a break-in. I was expecting pressure. My family never pushed quietly. They preferred scenes, conversations where everyone talked at once and nothing got written down. That afternoon, I drafted a letter addressed to Gina and my parents. It was not emotional. It stated that I was the sole owner of the house, that any attempt to enter without my explicit permission would be considered trespassing, and that any use of my address or property as collateral without my written consent would be treated as unauthorized. I printed 3 copies and sent them by certified mail. When the receipts came back signed, I put them in the same folder as the revocation and the title alert. It struck me that my family had taught me to save greeting cards, but not documents like these, as if emotion mattered more than the paper that actually shaped our lives. A few days later, my camera sent an alert while I was at work. The footage showed Gina standing on my porch in sunglasses and a hoodie, rattling the front doorknob before pressing her finger on the bell again and again. When no one answered, she looked straight into the camera, rolled her eyes, and walked away. That evening, my mother called from a number I did not recognize. When I let it go to voicemail, she left a long message mixing apologies with accusations. She said she had never meant for things to go this far, that she was only trying to secure a safety net for Gina, that I was making everyone look bad by treating my own family like strangers. I listened once and saved the recording, not because I wanted to replay it, but because Blake had told me that when people are angry, they often admit more than they intend. In between the emotional swings, my mother mentioned talking to a banker, to a friend who knew how to structure things, and to a neighbor who had signed over their house for less. Each detail was another line in a story I had not agreed to be part of. My father tried again too, this time with a short text saying he wanted to visit and clear the air. I answered with a single message that I was not accepting visitors, that any future communication about the house needed to go through email, and that I would not attend any more conversations framed as family meetings. None of it felt good. There was no satisfaction in drawing those lines, only a steady sense of necessity. For years, I had convinced myself that keeping the peace was the same as keeping myself safe. Standing in my own kitchen with a folder of certified mail receipts and screenshots from my front porch, I finally admitted that the quiet I had been defending was never really mine. Before I shut my laptop for the night, I forwarded copies of the letter and the delivery confirmations to Blake. He replied with a brief note saying that clear, written boundaries were my best protection now, and that if anyone ignored them, there were formal steps we could take through the civil court system. It was not a threat. It was a reminder that I was not stuck relying on family promises anymore. Weeks later, the house finally felt like it belonged to one person again. The first clear sign came in an email from Blake Stanton. He wrote that the lender who had inquired about my property had closed their file after being told there was no valid way to move forward without my signature. It was one paragraph, professional and dry, but I read it 3 times before filing it away with the rest of my documents. A second sign came from the neighborhood itself. One of my neighbors mentioned seeing Gina loading boxes into the back of a small car late one evening, a friend's vehicle packed with clothes, kitchen supplies, and the kind of mismatched items you grab when you are leaving somewhere you assumed would always be waiting for you. No furniture, no appliances, nothing that required planning. Whatever she had expected from my address clearly never materialized. The distance between us grew without any major confrontation. There was no final family meeting, no dramatic apology, no group decision around a dining table. There were just unanswered calls, messages left hanging, invitations to gatherings I chose not to attend. Each silence was a small cut in the rope that had tied my life to theirs. My mother sent one more long email, the kind that shifts tone every few sentences. She moved between frustration and nostalgia, reminding me of holidays we had spent together, school events she had attended, times when we had stood on the same side of things. Buried near the middle was a single line where she admitted she should have asked instead of arranging everything behind my back. I did not answer. I saved the message, but I didn't reply. Some sentences are acknowledgments, not repairs. Grief came in a strange form. My parents were still alive, living in the same city, buying groceries and filling their cars like everyone else. Yet I had to accept that the version of them I trusted was gone. There is a particular ache in realizing you will not get the parents you imagined, only the ones you actually have. News about Gina reached me indirectly. A cousin wrote that she had moved into a small rental across town and was working extra hours to keep up with her own bills. There were no more plans to use my house as leverage, no new schemes to secure quick money. She was finally living inside the limits of her own name. As for my father, he eventually stopped calling and switched to occasional group texts sent to extended family, messages I only saw because someone forwarded them by habit. In those updates, he described birthdays and graduations in broad terms, careful not to mention the split directly. On the rare occasion my name appeared, it was in a list, not as someone to be checked on. The hardest part was not the quiet, it was choosing not to break it. There were mornings when I reached for my phone out of reflex, ready to send a message saying we could sit down and work it out, that we could pretend the house had never been a battleground. Every time I stopped myself, I remembered the documents, the inquiries, the way my ownership had been treated like an obstacle to be worked around. Walking through my living room now, I still see the same worn couch and chipped coffee table, but they sit in a different kind of safety. The house did not change. I did. I learned that protecting yourself does not always look brave from the outside. Sometimes it looks like not showing up, not answering, not giving someone another chance to use your patience as a tool. If you grew up being told that keeping the family together is more important than keeping yourself safe, I hope my experience shows that another path exists. You can set boundaries without turning into the villain. You can walk away from people you love when they treat your life like something they are entitled to rearrange. One thing I learned is that paperwork and feelings are not enemies. For a long time, I thought asking for things in writing meant I didn't trust the people around me. Now I understand that clear agreements protect everyone who intends to act in good faith and expose those who do not. In a place like this country, where so much of life runs on signatures and records, ignoring that reality is just another way of pretending problems don't exist. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If any part of it made you think of your own boundaries, your own lines in the sand, you can share your thoughts in the comments so someone else who needs to read them might find them too.